20 cowboys had been thrown, trampled, and humiliated by the white stallion that terrorized the canyon lands, their broken bones and shattered pride testament to the horse's savage intelligence. James Wheeler, a 63-year-old drifter with calloused hands and a quiet voice, walked into that same canyon carrying nothing but a worn harmonica and a leather halter. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust settled slowly over the broken fence posts and scattered equipment, testimony to yet another failed attempt. 20 of the finest cowboys in 3 counties had tried their hand at capturing the legendary white stallion that roamed the canyon lands beyond the Thompson Ranch, and 20 had been sent home nursing their pride along with various bruises, sprains, and 1 broken collarbone. The horse had become something of a legend in those parts, a magnificent creature that seemed to embody the very spirit of the untamed West itself. Some said he was as tall as a barn door. Others swore his eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, and everyone agreed that no rope had ever held him, no corral had ever contained him, and no man had ever broken his will. The ranch owner, Marcus Thompson, stood in his dusty yard surveying the wreckage of the latest attempt with a grim expression. He was a wealthy man who had built his fortune on cattle and land, someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through money, influence, or sheer determination. The white stallion had become an obsession for him, not because he needed another horse, but because the animal's very existence seemed to mock everything Thompson believed about power and control. He had offered a substantial reward to anyone who could bring the horse in, and that reward had attracted every ambitious cowboy within riding distance. They had come with their finest lariats, their strongest ropes, their fastest horses, and their most confident swagger. They had left with none of those things intact. The stallion had first been spotted 3 years ago, emerging from the canyon like a ghost made flesh. He was enormous, standing at least 17 hands high, with a coat so pure white it seemed to capture and reflect the sunlight itself. His mane flowed like water, his muscles rippled with a power that spoke of wild places and untamed spirits. From the moment he appeared, he had captured the imagination of everyone who saw him, but he had also proven utterly impossible to approach. The few times cowboys had managed to get close enough to throw a rope, the stallion had moved with a speed and intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. He would dodge, feint, and circle back, leading his pursuers on exhausting chases that ended with broken equipment and exhausted horses. Some of the men who had tried to catch him spoke of the experience with an odd mixture of frustration and respect. They described a creature that seemed to understand their intentions before they acted, that moved with a grace that belied his massive size, and that possessed an intelligence far beyond what they expected from any horse. One cowboy, a grizzled veteran of many cattle drives, had said after his failed attempt that trying to catch that horse was like trying to lasso the wind itself. The comment had made the others laugh, but there was truth in it that everyone recognized. The failures had only increased Thompson's determination. He had brought in specialists from as far away as Texas and Colorado, men with reputations for breaking the most difficult horses. They had tried everything from complex trap systems to elaborate chases involving multiple riders. Nothing had worked. The stallion seemed to possess an uncanny ability to anticipate every strategy, to find the weakness in every plan, and to exploit it with a timing that left his would-be captors shaking their heads in disbelief. After each failed attempt, Thompson would increase the reward, and after each increase, more cowboys would arrive to try their luck. The cycle had continued for months, and the legend of the white stallion had grown with each telling. It was into this atmosphere of frustrated ambition and wounded pride that James Wheeler arrived one warm afternoon in late spring. He came not in response to the reward, but because he had heard about the situation from an old friend and felt a pull he could not quite explain. James was not like the other cowboys who had tried their hand at capturing the stallion. At 63 years old, he was past the age when most men still worked with horses in any serious capacity. His body bore the marks of a lifetime spent in hard labor. His hands were gnarled from years of holding reins and ropes, and his face was weathered by decades of sun and wind. He had served in the cavalry during the war, spending years working with horses in conditions that would have broken lesser men. After the war, he had drifted from ranch to ranch, always finding work because of his skill with difficult animals, but never staying long enough to put down roots. There was a quietness about James that set him apart from the younger, more boisterous cowboys. He did not speak unless he had something worth saying, and when he did speak, people tended to listen. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to conserve his energy, and there was a patience in his manner that came from having seen enough of life to know that not everything could be rushed. He wore simple clothes that had been mended multiple times, rode a horse that was as old and worn as he was, and carried himself with a humility that some mistook for weakness. Those who knew him better understood that his quiet demeanor concealed a deep well of knowledge and experience. When James rode into the Thompson Ranch that afternoon, he did not announce his intentions or make any grand claims. He simply asked if he might water his horse and rest for a spell before moving on. Thompson, who was in the yard directing the cleanup from the latest failed capture attempt, barely glanced at the old man. He saw only another drifter, someone passing through on their way to somewhere else, hardly worth his attention. It was one of the ranch hands, a young man named Billy who had worked with James years ago on another ranch, who recognized him and called out in greeting. The reunion was warm but brief. Billy explained the situation with the white stallion, gesturing toward the broken fences and scattered equipment as evidence of the latest failure. James listened without comment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Billy finished his explanation and mentioned the substantial reward Thompson was offering, James simply nodded and asked if he might see the horse for himself. Billy laughed at that, explaining that the stallion was wild and unpredictable, that he might be anywhere in the vast canyon lands, and that even if they found him, getting close enough to see him properly was nearly impossible. James accepted this information with the same quiet composure he showed for everything else. He thanked Billy for the water, declined an offer to stay for supper, and rode out toward the canyons as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. Billy watched him go with a mixture of affection and concern, remembering the older man's skill with horses but worrying that age had diminished his abilities. Thompson, overhearing the conversation, made a dismissive comment about old men who did not know when to step aside for younger blood. Billy said nothing in response, but something in his expression suggested he would not bet against James Wheeler, regardless of his age. As James rode into the canyon lands, the landscape opened up before him in a display of raw, natural beauty. Red rock formations rose like ancient cathedrals, carved by millennia of wind and water into shapes that defied easy description. Juniper trees clung to impossible slopes, their twisted trunks testament to their stubborn determination to survive. The air was clean and dry, carrying the scent of sage and wild grasses. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on thermal currents, and somewhere further away a coyote called to its pack. This was country that had not changed much since the first peoples walked it thousands of years ago, and James felt a familiar peace settle over him as he moved deeper into it. He was not thinking about rewards or reputation, or proving anything to anyone. He was simply doing what he had always done, following an instinct that had served him well throughout his long life with horses. James spent 3 days in the canyon lands before he even caught his first glimpse of the white stallion. Those 3 days were not wasted time, though another man might have seen them that way. James used them to learn the rhythms of the place, to understand the patterns of water and grass, to identify the trails that animals used and the places where they gathered. He moved slowly and deliberately, never pushing, never rushing, simply becoming a part of the landscape until his presence no longer disturbed the natural flow of life around him. He watched where the deer went at dawn, noted where the rabbits emerged at dusk, and paid attention to the calls of birds that might signal the approach of larger animals. On the morning of the fourth day, as the sun was just beginning to paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and amber, James was watering his horse at a small spring when he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was an old instinct, one developed over years of cavalry service when being alert to your surroundings could mean the difference between life and death. He did not turn around immediately or make any sudden movements. Instead, he continued what he was doing, letting his horse drink, while slowly becoming aware of the presence behind him. When he finally did turn, moving with careful slowness, he saw the white stallion standing on a ridge perhaps 200 yards away. The stories had not exaggerated the horse's magnificence. If anything, they had understated it. The stallion stood against the morning sky like something carved from marble and given breath, his white coat gleaming in the early light, his mane lifting slightly in the breeze that moved through the canyon. He was watching James with an intensity that was almost palpable, his head held high, his ears forward, every line of his body speaking of power, held in perfect control. For a long moment, neither man nor horse moved. They simply regarded each other across the distance, taking each other's measure in that timeless way that predator and prey, hunter and hunted, have done since the beginning of time. James felt something shift in his chest as he looked at the stallion. It was not the excitement of a hunter spotting his quarry, nor was it the calculating assessment of a man sizing up a business opportunity. It was something deeper and more complex, a recognition of something in the horse that called to something in himself. He saw in that magnificent creature a spirit that had not been broken by the attempts to capture it, a will that remained fierce and free despite all the efforts to contain it. There was a pride in the way the stallion held himself, but it was not the arrogance of cruelty or dominance. It was simply the natural confidence of a being that knew its own worth and refused to compromise it for anyone or anything. The moment stretched out, neither man nor horse making a move to break it. James's own horse, an old gelding that had been his companion for years, lifted its head from the water and looked toward the stallion with interest but no alarm. The white horse shifted his weight slightly, muscles rippling beneath that pristine coat, but he did not move away. James had the distinct impression that the stallion was curious, that he was assessing this new human who had entered his territory with the same careful attention that James was giving to him. It was different from the other encounters the horse must have had with the cowboys who came with their ropes and their loud confidence. James brought none of that energy with him. He brought only patience and a quiet respect for what stood before him. After what might have been 5 minutes or might have been 30, the stallion turned and moved away, not in flight but in a measured departure that suggested he was leaving on his own terms rather than being driven away. James watched him go, noting the direction he took, the easy power of his movement, the way he seemed to flow over the rough terrain, as if it were flat ground. When the horse disappeared behind a formation of red rock, James returned his attention to his own mount, checking the saddle and preparing to move on. He did not attempt to follow the stallion immediately. That would have been a mistake, a violation of the delicate understanding that seemed to have passed between them during that long moment of mutual observation. Over the following days, James continued his patient exploration of the canyon lands, and the white stallion continued to appear at irregular intervals, always at a distance, always watching. Sometimes James would catch sight of him on a far ridge, a white shape against the red rock that might have been a trick of the light, except for the way it moved. Other times he would round a bend in a canyon and find the horse standing in plain view, as if he had been waiting for James to arrive. These encounters followed a pattern that James recognized from his years of working with difficult horses. The stallion was testing him, measuring his intentions, trying to understand what kind of threat or opportunity this quiet old man represented. James never made any attempt to approach the horse during these sightings. He would acknowledge the stallion's presence with a glance, sometimes with a slight nod as if greeting a neighbor, and then continue about his business. He made camp each evening in different locations, always near water, always in places where he could see approaches from multiple directions. He ate simple meals of jerky and hardtack, supplemented occasionally with fish from the streams or edible plants he recognized from his years of frontier living. He spent his evenings watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky, listening to the sounds of the canyon at night, and thinking about the magnificent creature that had become the focus of his attention. The more James observed the stallion, the more he understood why all the previous attempts to capture him had failed. The other cowboys had approached the task as a conquest, a battle of wills in which the man would prove his dominance over the beast. They had brought aggression and force, ropes and traps, the full weight of human ingenuity bent toward the goal of subduing and controlling. The stallion had responded to each of these approaches in kind, using his own considerable intelligence and physical capabilities to evade, escape, and ultimately humiliate his would-be captors. It had become a game in which the horse held every advantage because he was fighting on his own ground and playing by rules that came naturally to him. James understood that a different approach was required. You could not capture a spirit like the white stallion through force. You could only invite it to come to you of its own accord. And even then, you had to be willing to accept that it might choose not to come. This was not the kind of wisdom that could be taught in books or learned through formal instruction. It came from years of observation, from countless hours spent in the company of horses, from the humility that comes with age and experience. James had broken horses in his younger days, had used the traditional methods of force and intimidation that were common on the frontier. But he had also seen the cost of those methods in the broken spirits and fearful eyes of animals that had been conquered rather than convinced. As the days passed and his supplies began to run low, James knew he would need to return to the ranch soon for provisions. But before he did, he wanted to try something, to test a theory that had been forming in his mind during his observations of the stallion. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the canyon walls in shades of purple and gold, James made camp near a spring that he had noticed the stallion visiting regularly. He built his fire in a small pit surrounded by stones, keeping the flames low and adding only dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. He prepared his simple meal and ate it slowly, and then he did something that would have seemed foolish to the younger cowboys who had tried their hand at capturing the white horse. He took out a worn harmonica that he carried in his pack and began to play. The music was simple, old songs from his childhood and his years in the cavalry, melodies that spoke of loneliness and longing, of wide-open spaces, and the comfort of companionship. The notes drifted out across the canyon, soft and plaintive, carrying on the evening breeze. James was not thinking about the stallion as he played. He was simply doing something he had done countless times before, finding solace in music at the end of a long day. But as he played, he became aware of a presence in the darkness beyond his fire, and when he paused between songs, he heard the soft sound of hoofbeats on stone. The white stallion emerged from the shadows at the edge of the firelight, moving with that same careful grace that James had observed before. He did not approach close to the camp, maintaining a distance of perhaps 50 feet, but he did not flee either. He simply stood there, his white coat gleaming in the mixed light of fire and twilight, his dark eyes reflecting the flames as he watched the old man with the harmonica. James felt his heart quicken at this unexpected approach, but he forced himself to remain calm and still. James understood in that moment that he needed to make a choice. He could put down the harmonica and try to move closer to the stallion, potentially breaking whatever fragile connection had brought the horse to his camp, or he could continue doing what he had been doing, respecting the distance the stallion had chosen to maintain, and see what happened. he chose the latter. Slowly, with movements as gentle as those he might use with a newborn foal, James raised the harmonica to his lips again and resumed playing. The notes flowed out into the night air, simple and honest, carrying no demand or expectation. He played as if the stallion were not there at all, as if this were just another evening of solitary music in the wilderness. The white horse remained at the edge of the firelight for perhaps 20 minutes, standing so still he might have been carved from stone except for the occasional movement of his ears toward the music and the soft gleam of his eyes in the firelight. Then, as silently as he had come, he turned and melted back into the darkness. James continued playing for a few more minutes after the horse departed, then carefully put away the harmonica and sat looking into the fire. Something important had happened, though he could not have explained exactly what it was to anyone who asked. A door had opened, just a crack, and the white stallion had looked through it at him. Whether the horse would choose to open that door further remained to be seen. The next morning, James rode back to the Thompson ranch to replenish his supplies. The journey took most of the day, and when he arrived in the late afternoon, he found the place in a state of increased activity. More cowboys had arrived, drawn by the ever-increasing reward Thompson was offering for the capture of the white stallion. They were younger men mostly, full of confidence and swagger, discussing their plans and strategies with the loud certainty of those who had never failed at anything they considered important. They looked at James with the casual dismissiveness that youth often shows toward age, seeing only an old man on an older horse, hardly worth their notice or concern. Thompson himself was in the yard, supervising the preparation for what he was calling his final attempt to capture the stallion. He had brought in a specialist from California, a man with a reputation for catching wild horses using a technique that involved multiple riders working in coordinated patterns to exhaust and corner their quarry. The specialist, a lean man named Cordell, with cold eyes and an air of professional competence, was explaining his method to the assembled cowboys. The plan involved 6 riders working in shifts, keeping the stallion moving constantly until exhaustion made him vulnerable to capture. It was a brutal approach that worked through attrition rather than skill, wearing down the animal's resistance through relentless pressure. James listened to this explanation while he loaded supplies onto his pack horse, saying nothing. Billy, the young ranch hand who had recognized him on his first visit, came over to help with the supplies and asked how the search was going. James responded with non-committal phrases that revealed nothing of substance. He had learned long ago that some things were better kept to oneself, especially when dealing with men whose motivations differed fundamentally from your own. Billy seemed to understand this and did not press for details, though James caught the younger man studying him with a thoughtful expression that suggested he suspected more than James was saying. As James was preparing to leave, Thompson approached him for the first time. The ranch owner looked James up and down with an expression that mixed curiosity and skepticism. He had heard from Billy that the old man had some skill with horses, and while Thompson doubted that age-diminished abilities could succeed where younger, stronger men had failed, he was superstitious enough to worry about missing any opportunity. He asked James bluntly if he had seen the white stallion during his time in the canyons. James considered the question carefully before responding that he had caught a glimpse or two, nothing more. Thompson studied him for a moment as if trying to determine whether the old man was being truthful, then made a proposition. If James could catch the stallion, Thompson would pay him double the posted reward. The offer was substantial, more money than James had seen in years, perhaps more than he had ever possessed at one time in his entire life. It was the kind of sum that could change everything for a man in his position, providing security and comfort in his declining years. Thompson clearly expected this offer to light a fire under the old cowboy, to transform him from a casual observer into a motivated participant in the hunt. But James's response was not what Thompson anticipated. After a long pause, during which James appeared to be giving the matter serious consideration, he simply said that he would keep the offer in mind and would let Thompson know if anything came of his efforts. Then he mounted his horse and rode back toward the canyons, leaving Thompson standing in the yard with a puzzled expression on his face. The truth was that James had no interest in Thompson's money, at least not in the way Thompson imagined. The reward had never been his motivation for spending time in the canyon lands, and the increased offer did not change his fundamental approach to the situation. What James wanted, though he would have struggled to put it into words, was something far more intangible than money. He wanted to understand the white stallion, to bridge the gap between their different worlds, to achieve a connection based on mutual respect rather than domination. If that connection eventually led to the horse being willing to leave the canyons and return to the ranch with him, then so be it. But the money was incidental to what he was really seeking. As James rode back into the canyon lands that evening, he felt a growing sense of urgency that had nothing to do with the reward. He knew that Thompson's new plan would be implemented soon, probably within the next few days, and he understood what that would mean for the white stallion. The coordinated chase that Cordell had described would put enormous stress on the horse, pushing him to the limits of his endurance and possibly beyond. Even if the stallion managed to evade capture, which James suspected he would, the experience would change him. It would reinforce his wariness of humans, deepen his mistrust, and make any future attempts at connection infinitely more difficult. The door that had opened slightly during that evening by the fire would slam shut and likely never open again. James made camp that night at the same spring where the stallion had appeared before, and once again he built his small fire and took out his harmonica. He played the same simple melodies, letting the music drift out across the darkening canyon. He did not know if the horse would come again, and he tried not to let hope or expectation color his actions. He simply played, offering the music as he might offer a gift to a friend, with no strings attached and no demands for reciprocation. The night settled around him, cool and clear, with stars emerging one by one in the vast desert sky. This time the stallion appeared more quickly, materializing from the darkness with that same ghostly silence. But instead of stopping at the edge of the firelight as he had before, the horse moved closer. Not dramatically closer, perhaps only 10 feet nearer than his previous position, but the change was significant. James continued playing without acknowledging the horse's approach, though his heart was beating faster, and he had to consciously steady his breathing to keep the notes smooth and even. The stallion stood in the flickering light, his white coat seeming to glow with its own inner radiance, his eyes fixed on the old man and the small harmonica that produced such strange and haunting sounds. When James finished the song he was playing, he lowered the harmonica slowly and spoke for the first time in the horse's presence. His voice was quiet and gentle, pitched low so as not to startle. He did not speak to the stallion as one might address a pet or a possession. Instead, he spoke as he might to another person, with respect and recognition of the intelligence and awareness he saw in those dark eyes. He told the stallion that he understood why the horse had remained free for so long, that he recognized the intelligence and spirit that made capture impossible through force. He said that he meant no harm, that he was simply an old man who had spent his life around horses and who could appreciate what stood before him. He spoke about the other men who would be coming soon, the coordinated hunt that Thompson was planning, and what it would mean for the stallion. He did not make promises or offers, did not try to convince or manipulate. He simply shared information, as one might share news with a neighbor, and left it to the horse to decide what to do with that information. The stallion listened with his ears pricked forward, his body language suggesting attention rather than alarm. When James finished speaking, there was a long moment of silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. Then the stallion took a single step closer, then another, moving with careful deliberation until he was near enough that James could have reached out and touched him if he had extended his arm. James did not move. He sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, while the great white horse lowered his head and examined him with those intelligent dark eyes. The horse sniffed at James, learning his scent, processing information about this strange human who sat by fires and made music and spoke in quiet tones that carried no threat. James could feel the horse's warm breath on his face, could see the fine details of his coat and the incredible power contained in the muscles beneath. He could also see the scars, small marks that spoke of encounters with other predators, with harsh weather, with the challenges of surviving in this unforgiving landscape. The stallion was not some mythical creature immune to the difficulties of life. He was flesh and blood, subject to the same vulnerabilities as any other living thing, but possessed of a will and intelligence that had kept him alive and free when other horses would have fallen or been captured. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, the stallion raised his head and took a step back. He did not flee or show alarm. He simply returned to his previous distance, maintaining that careful boundary between them. James resumed playing his harmonica, and the horse remained there for another hour, listening to the music and watching the old man. When he finally left, disappearing into the darkness as silently as he had come, James sat for a long time staring into the dying fire and thinking about what had just occurred. Something profound had happened. A connection had been made that went beyond anything he had experienced with a horse before. Over the next 3 days, the pattern continued and deepened. Each evening, James would make camp at the spring, build his fire, and play his harmonica. Each evening, the stallion would appear, sometimes quickly, sometimes after James had been playing for an hour or more. The distance between them gradually decreased until the horse was standing close enough that James could have touched him without stretching. But James never made that move. He understood instinctively that the initiative had to come from the horse, that any attempt to force or hurry the process would destroy everything they had built. During the days, James observed the stallion from a distance, learning his habits and routines. He saw where the horse drank, where he grazed, where he rested during the heat of midday. He noticed that the stallion was not completely alone. There was a small band of mares that seemed to acknowledge him as their leader, though they kept their distance and fled at any sign of human presence. The stallion would occasionally join them for brief periods, but he always returned to his solitary wanderings, as if he preferred his own company to even that of his own kind. James also became aware that they were not alone in the canyons. On the morning of the 3rd day, he spotted riders in the distance, moving in a coordinated pattern that he recognized from Cordell's description. Thompson's hunt had begun. The Cowboys were working in shifts as planned, keeping constant pressure on the stallion, never giving him time to rest or feed properly. James watched from a concealed position as the white horse evaded their attempts to corner him, using his knowledge of the terrain and his superior stamina to stay just out of reach. But James could see that the constant harassment was taking its toll. The stallion was moving with less of his usual grace, his sides were heaving more than they should, and there was a wildness in his eyes that had not been there before. That evening, when the stallion appeared at James's camp, the change was even more obvious. The horse was agitated, moving restlessly, his ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds from all directions. He did not approach as close as he had been doing, maintaining a greater distance as if his trust had been shaken by the day's events. James understood what this meant. The coordinated hunt was undoing all the careful work he had done to build a connection with the horse. If it continued, the stallion would become so wary and traumatized that approaching him would become impossible. James made a decision that night, one that went against his natural inclination to avoid conflict and stay out of other people's business. In the morning, he would ride back to the Thompson ranch and try to convince the owner to call off the hunt. He knew it was a long shot. Thompson had invested considerable money in this operation and had his pride at stake. But James had to try. The alternative was to watch something rare and beautiful be destroyed by men who saw the stallion only as a challenge to be conquered rather than a living being worthy of respect. The next morning, James arrived at the ranch just as Cordell and his team were preparing to ride out for another day of pursuit. Thompson was there, looking tired but determined. The hunt had gone on for 3 days without success, and the frustration was evident in his face and manner. When James approached and asked to speak with him privately, Thompson initially refused, saying he had no time for the old cowboy's concerns. But something in James's demeanor, a quiet insistence that would not be easily dismissed, made Thompson reconsider. He led James to his study and asked brusquely what was so important that it could not wait. James spoke carefully, choosing his words with the same attention he brought to all his interactions with difficult situations. He explained that the coordinated hunt, while perhaps eventually successful in exhausting the stallion, would break the horse's spirit in the process. What Thompson would capture, if the hunt succeeded, would not be the magnificent creature that had captured everyone's imagination. It would be a traumatized animal, its will broken, its spirit crushed, useful perhaps for breeding, but never again displaying the qualities that made it special in the first place. Thompson listened to this explanation with growing impatience, his fingers drumming on the desk that separated them. When James finished, the ranch owner leaned back in his chair and regarded the old cowboy with an expression that mixed skepticism with barely concealed contempt. He said that he had not asked for James's opinion on how to handle his business, that he had hired professionals who knew what they were doing, and that if James thought he could do better, he was welcome to try. The sarcasm in his voice made it clear that Thompson considered the possibility of James succeeding where younger, stronger men had failed to be essentially zero. James absorbed this response without visible reaction. He had expected nothing different. Men like Thompson rarely listened to advice that contradicted their own plans, especially when that advice came from someone they considered beneath their station. But James had not come seeking permission or approval. He had come to make an offer, and he made it now in the same quiet, steady voice he had used for everything else. He would bring the stallion in within 1 week, using his own methods, without the coordinated hunt or the exhausting chases. If he succeeded, Thompson would pay him the promised reward. If he failed, he would accept that failure and ride away with no complaints or excuses. Thompson studied James for a long moment, trying to determine if the old man was serious or simply deluded by age and overconfidence. There was something in James's demeanor, however, a calm certainty that did not match his shabby clothes or weathered appearance, that gave Thompson pause. The ranch owner had built his fortune partly through an ability to read people, to sense when someone was bluffing and when they genuinely believed in what they were saying. James, he realized, genuinely believed he could do what he claimed. Whether that belief was justified remained to be seen, but Thompson found himself curious despite his skepticism. After a long pause, Thompson agreed to the terms with one significant modification. He would call off Cordell and the coordinated hunt for 3 days, not a week. If James had not produced results by then, the professional operation would resume, and James would be expected to stay out of the way. 3 days was barely enough time, and both men knew it, but James understood that it was the best offer he would get. He accepted with a simple nod, then turned and left the study before Thompson could change his mind or add additional conditions. As James rode back toward the canyons, he felt the weight of what he had just committed to. 3 days was not much time to accomplish what he hoped to achieve, especially since the coordinated hunt had undone much of the trust he had been building with the stallion. But he also felt a sense of relief that the constant harassment of the horse would stop, at least temporarily. That would give the stallion time to recover some of his equilibrium, to remember that not all humans brought stress and danger. It would also give James the opportunity to rebuild what had been damaged and perhaps take the connection to its next logical step. That evening, James made camp at the spring as usual, but this time he brought something with him that he had not brought before. From his pack he extracted a worn leather halter, one he had carried with him for years. It was old and soft from use, the leather darkened by sweat and oil, the brass fittings tarnished but still functional. James had made this halter himself decades ago, fashioning it carefully during long winter evenings in cavalry barracks, and it had served him well through countless interactions with countless horses. He set it on the ground beside him, not hiding it, but not making it obvious either, just another object in his camp. When the stallion appeared that evening, James could see that the absence of the hunting parties had already made a difference. The horse moved with more of his usual confidence, though there was still a wariness in his eyes that had not been there before the hunt began. He approached to within about 15 feet of James and stopped, his attention fixed on the old man with that same intense focus. James played his harmonica as usual, the familiar melodies drifting out across the canyon, and the stallion stood listening. But tonight James added something new to the routine. Between songs, he spoke to the horse again, his voice low and conversational. He talked about his life, about the years he had spent in the cavalry, about the horses he had known and worked with over the decades. He spoke of the ones he had liked and the ones he had not, the easy horses and the difficult ones, the successes and the failures. He talked about growing old, about the way the body slows down while the mind remains as sharp as ever, creating a frustrating gap between what you want to do and what you can actually accomplish. He spoke of loneliness, of the peculiar isolation that comes from being always on the move, never settling long enough to build the kinds of connections that make life feel anchored and meaningful. The stallion listened to all of this with his ears forward, occasionally shifting his weight or tossing his head, but never leaving or showing alarm. James had no idea how much the horse understood of his words, if anything, but that was not really the point. The point was the tone, the rhythm, the creation of a soundscape that included not just music but also the human voice speaking without demands or expectations. It was another form of communication, another way of saying that he meant no harm, that he offered companionship rather than dominance. As the evening wore on and the fire burned down to embers, James stood slowly, his joints protesting after sitting in one position for so long. The stallion watched this movement but did not retreat. James stretched carefully, working out the stiffness, then bent and picked up the leather halter from where it lay beside his blanket. He held it loosely in his hands, making no move toward the horse, simply letting the stallion see what he held. The horse's eyes fixed on the halter, and for a moment James thought he might bolt, but the stallion held his ground, watching with intense focus as James turned the halter over in his hands, examining it as if seeing it for the first time. James spoke again, telling the stallion what the halter was, what it meant, what he hoped to do with it. He explained that it was not a cage or a trap, but rather a tool for communication, a way for horse and human to work together rather than against each other. He said that he would never force the halter onto the stallion, that it would have to be the horse's choice whether to accept it or not. He acknowledged that accepting the halter would mean giving up some measure of the freedom the stallion had fought so hard to maintain, but suggested that it might also mean gaining something valuable in exchange, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than fear. The stallion listened to all of this with an intensity that suggested comprehension, though James knew that might be projection on his part, seeing what he wanted to see rather than what was actually there. When he finished speaking, James hung the halter on a low branch of a nearby juniper tree, where it was visible but not threatening, then returned to his fire and lay down in his blankets. The stallion remained where he was for another hour, occasionally looking toward the halter hanging on the branch before finally melting away into the darkness. James did not sleep well that night. He lay awake thinking about the 2 days he had left, about whether his approach would work or whether he was deluding himself with romantic notions about horse-human connection. The morning sun found James already awake, heating water for coffee over a small fire. He had perhaps 36 hours left before Thompson would resume the coordinated hunt, and he had accomplished nothing tangible to show for his efforts. The leather halter still hung from the juniper branch where he had placed it the night before, swaying slightly in the early morning breeze. James drank his coffee slowly, watching the steam rise from the tin cup and thinking about what he should do next. Every instinct told him to be patient, to continue with the slow approach that had been building trust gradually. But patience required time, and time was the one thing he did not have in abundance. As the day warmed and the sun climbed higher, James went about the mundane tasks of camp maintenance. He gathered firewood, refilled his water containers from the spring, and checked his supplies to see what remained. He was running low on coffee and bacon, down to his last few pieces of hardtack. But he had enough to last the remaining time if he was careful. His horse, the old gelding that had been his companion for so many years, grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally lifting its head to look toward the canyons as if it too were waiting for the white stallion to appear. The stallion did not show himself during the day, which was not unusual. James had observed that the horse preferred the cooler hours of early morning and evening, resting during the heat of midday in shaded spots among the rocks. James used the time to walk the area around his camp, not searching for the horse, but simply familiarizing himself more thoroughly with the terrain. He found several places where the stallion had been recently, recognizing his tracks in the soft earth near water sources, and seeing the signs of where he had grazed or rolled in the dust. These traces of the horse's presence gave James hope that their connection had not been completely undone by the stress of the coordinated hunt. As evening approached, James prepared for what he sensed might be a crucial night. He built his fire with particular care, using only the driest wood that would produce minimal smoke and maximum light. He positioned himself so that he could see the approaches to his camp from multiple directions, not because he feared danger, but because he wanted to observe the stallion's arrival if the horse chose to come. The halter still hung from the juniper branch, now familiar enough to be part of the landscape rather than an intrusive foreign object. James settled into his usual spot, took out his harmonica, and began to play. The music flowed out across the canyon as it had for so many evenings now, simple melodies that required no great skill but that carried the weight of James's intentions and emotions. He played songs his mother had sung when he was a child, tunes he had learned from fellow soldiers during the war, melodies that had no particular name but that had become part of his personal repertoire over the years. The sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the rocks in shades of orange and red before fading to purple and then to the deep blue of twilight. Stars began to emerge overhead, first a few and then thousands, until the sky was a vast canopy of light. The stallion came as full darkness settled over the canyon. James heard him before he saw him, a soft sound of hooves on stone that might have gone unnoticed by someone less attuned to such things. The white horse materialized from the shadows, his coat seeming to gather what little light remained and reflect it back. But tonight something was different. Instead of stopping at his usual distance, the stallion kept walking, moving slowly but steadily closer to where James sat. James continued playing, forcing himself not to react to this unprecedented approach, but his heart was beating faster, and he had to concentrate to keep his breathing steady. The horse came to within 10 feet, then 5, then close enough that James could have reached out and touched him with minimal effort. James finished the song he was playing and lowered the harmonica, looking up at the magnificent creature that stood before him. The stallion's head was lowered slightly, his ears forward, his posture suggesting curiosity rather than fear or aggression. For a long moment they looked at each other in silence, and James felt a connection so profound that it seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between species. Here was a being as alive and aware as he was himself, choosing freely to stand in his presence, to trust him enough to overcome the natural wariness that had kept him safe and free. James spoke softly, thanking the stallion for coming, acknowledging the gift of trust that this approach represented. He made no move toward the horse, content simply to share this space in this moment. After several minutes, the stallion took another step forward, bringing his head down until his muzzle was nearly touching James's shoulder. James held perfectly still, barely breathing, while the horse explored him with the sensitive whiskers around his mouth and nose. The stallion sniffed at James's shirt, his hat, his hands, learning his scent in intimate detail. Then, in a gesture that brought unexpected moisture to James's eyes, the horse gently nuzzled his shoulder, a clear sign of acceptance and affection. This was the moment James had been working toward, the breakthrough that all his patient efforts had been designed to achieve. But instead of taking advantage of it by attempting to halter the horse, James simply raised his hand slowly and laid it gently on the stallion's neck. He felt the warmth of the horse's body, the solid reality of muscle and bone beneath the soft coat, the slight tremor that ran through the animal at this first deliberate physical contact between them. James stroked the neck gently, his touch light and reassuring, and the stallion stood accepting it, his eyes half closed in what might have been pleasure or simply relaxation. They remained that way for perhaps 10 minutes, James gently stroking the stallion's neck while the horse stood quietly accepting this attention. Then, without any sign of distress or hurry, the stallion lifted his head and stepped back. He did not leave entirely, retreating only to his previous comfortable distance, where he stood watching James with those dark, intelligent eyes. James picked up his harmonica and resumed playing, and the stallion remained there for another hour before finally disappearing into the night. James lay awake for a long time after the horse departed, replaying every moment of the encounter in his mind. He had crossed a threshold tonight, achieved a level of acceptance that went beyond mere tolerance of his presence. The stallion had actively sought contact, had invited touch, had shown trust in the most fundamental way possible. But James also understood that what had happened was not the same as accomplishing what he had promised Thompson. The horse had accepted his presence and his touch in the context of these evening encounters by the fire. That was very different from accepting a halter and following James back to the ranch. The next day dawned clear and hot. James had less than 24 hours remaining before Thompson's deadline expired, and the coordinated hunt would resume. He spent the morning in camp, conserving his energy and thinking about how to proceed. He knew that attempting to rush things now would be a mistake that could undo everything he had accomplished. But he also knew that he could not simply continue with the gradual approach that had served him well so far. He needed to find a way to translate the trust the stallion had shown into something more concrete, to ask the horse to take a step that went beyond accepting his presence to actively choosing to come with him. As the afternoon heat became oppressive, James sought shade under an overhang of rock near his camp. His old gelding stood nearby, head lowered and eyes half closed in the drowsy state that horses adopt in extreme heat. James watched a hawk circling high above, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-baked rocks, and found himself thinking about freedom and what it meant. That hawk could go anywhere it wanted, limited only by the need to find food and water and the boundaries of its own endurance. The white stallion possessed a similar freedom, roaming these canyons as he pleased, answering to no one. What James was proposing would fundamentally change that. Even if the horse came willingly, even if the relationship remained one of partnership rather than domination, there would still be fences and stables, human schedules, and human expectations. Was he right to ask that sacrifice of a creature that had fought so hard to remain free? But James also knew that the coordinated hunt would resume if he failed, and that even if the stallion evaded capture this time, Thompson would eventually succeed through sheer persistence and overwhelming force. The world was changing, the wild spaces shrinking, and ultimately there would be no room left for horses like the white stallion who refused to bend to human will. Perhaps what James offered was not ideal, but it might be the best option available. At least with James, the horse would retain some measure of dignity and autonomy. With Thompson's methods, he would be reduced to a broken creature, his spirit crushed along with his resistance. These thoughts occupied James throughout the hot afternoon. When evening finally arrived and the temperature began to drop, he felt both relief and trepidation. This would be his last chance to achieve what he had promised. Tomorrow morning, Thompson would send out the riders again, and everything James had built would collapse under the weight of renewed harassment and stress. He prepared his camp with even more care than usual, arranging everything to perfection, and as the sun touched the horizon, he took his position and began to play. The stallion came early, appearing while the sky still held traces of daylight. He moved directly to the close distance that had become comfortable for him over the previous nights and stood watching James with what seemed like expectation. James played several songs, establishing the familiar pattern, then lowered his harmonica and spoke. He told the stallion that time had run out, that tomorrow the other men would return with their ropes and their coordinated chases. He said that he wished he had more time to let things develop naturally, but circumstances had forced his hand. He explained that he was going to retrieve the halter from the juniper branch and that he hoped the stallion would accept it, but that if the horse chose to refuse, James would respect that decision and not pursue him further. James stood slowly and walked to the juniper tree, acutely aware of the stallion's eyes following his every movement. He took the leather halter down from the branch and returned to his fire, holding the halter loosely in his hands. The stallion watched, but did not retreat. James sat back down and placed the halter on the ground between them, where both could see it clearly. Then he resumed playing his harmonica, as if this were just another ordinary evening and not the culmination of everything he had been working toward. After perhaps 20 minutes, the stallion took a step forward, then another. He approached the halter with his neck extended, sniffing at it cautiously. James continued playing, not looking directly at the horse, giving him space to explore without feeling watched or judged. The stallion nosed the halter, pushing it slightly with his muzzle, testing its weight and texture. He explored it thoroughly, taking his time, occasionally glancing toward James as if seeking reassurance or permission. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the stallion took another step forward, positioning himself so that his head was directly over the halter. James lowered his harmonica and spoke softly, telling the horse that he understood what this meant, that he recognized the trust being offered and would honor it. Moving with infinite care, James picked up the halter and slowly stood. The stallion tensed slightly, but did not move away. James approached at an angle, not head-on, moving smoothly and steadily. When he was close enough to touch the horse, he paused, giving the stallion one final opportunity to change his mind and flee. The horse remained still. James raised the halter slowly, talking continuously in that quiet voice that had become so familiar to the stallion. He positioned the halter carefully, not forcing it, but simply holding it in place and waiting for the horse to make the final decision. For several seconds, nothing happened, and James began to think that he had pushed too far, asked too much. Then the stallion lowered his head slightly, a subtle but unmistakable movement that allowed the halter to slide into position. James secured the buckle with trembling fingers, hardly able to believe what had just occurred. The white stallion stood wearing a halter for the first time in his life, and the world did not end. He shook his head experimentally, feeling the unfamiliar weight and pressure, but he did not panic or try to tear it off. James held the lead rope loosely, maintaining contact but not pulling or directing. They stood together in the firelight, man and horse, connected now by more than just proximity and developing trust. The physical connection of rope and leather created a new reality, one that would require adjustments and negotiations from both of them. James spent the rest of that evening simply being with the stallion, making no demands beyond accepting the halter's presence. He sat by his fire while the horse stood nearby, occasionally touching his shoulder with his muzzle or breathing softly against his neck. It was a remarkable display of trust, and James felt the weight of responsibility that came with it. This magnificent creature had chosen to surrender a portion of his freedom, had placed himself voluntarily in a position of vulnerability. James understood that he must prove himself worthy of that trust, must demonstrate through his actions that the horse's faith had not been misplaced. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, James made a decision. He would not attempt to lead the stallion back to the ranch in the morning. Instead, he would spend one more day here in the canyons, giving the horse time to become accustomed to wearing the halter, to understand that it did not mean the end of all comfort and freedom. This would cost him Thompson's deadline, would probably cost him the reward as well. But James found that he did not care. His commitment now was to the horse, not to the ranch owner or his money. Whatever happened would happen on terms that respected the stallion's dignity and autonomy. James removed the halter before settling down to sleep, not wanting to leave it on overnight when he could not supervise. The stallion accepted this removal as calmly as he had accepted the initial placement, then moved off to a distance of about 30 feet, where he stood drowsing through the night. James lay in his blankets, looking up at the stars, feeling more at peace than he had in years. The morning arrived with a clarity that seemed to match James's state of mind. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and lay in his blankets, watching the sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gold of early sunrise. The white stallion was still there, standing about 40 feet away, his coat catching the first rays of sunlight and seeming to glow with an inner radiance. When James stirred and began moving about his camp, the horse watched with interest but no alarm, a dramatic change from the wary distance he had maintained during their first encounters. James went through his morning routine with deliberate calm, building up his fire, heating water for coffee, eating a simple breakfast of the last of his bacon and hardtack. He was aware that by now Thompson would have sent out Cordell and his team to resume the coordinated hunt. They would be looking for the stallion in the usual places, following the patterns they had established during their previous attempts. James knew these canyons well enough by now to avoid the areas where the hunters were likely to concentrate, and he planned to keep the stallion away from them while he continued the process of building trust and acceptance. After breakfast, James approached the stallion slowly, the leather halter in his hands. He spoke softly as he came near, explaining what he intended to do, giving the horse time to prepare mentally for the experience. The stallion stood calmly as James slipped the halter over his head and secured the buckle. There was a moment of tension when the horse felt the leather settle into place, a slight stiffening of his muscles and a widening of his eyes. But James maintained his calm presence, his hands gentle and his voice soothing, and the stallion relaxed again, accepting what had seemed impossible just days before. James did not immediately attempt to lead the horse. Instead, he simply held the lead rope loosely and stood beside the stallion, letting him become accustomed to the sensation of being connected to a human through this physical link. After several minutes, James began walking slowly away from the horse, playing out the rope as he moved. The stallion watched this movement with interest, and when the rope reached its full extension, James applied the gentlest possible pressure, not pulling but simply creating a subtle suggestion of direction. The horse resisted momentarily, then took a tentative step forward. James immediately released the pressure and praised the stallion warmly. It was a tiny victory, but victories with horses were built from such small increments of progress. They spent the morning in this fashion, James asking for small movements and the stallion gradually learning to respond to the pressure of the lead rope. There was no force involved, no battle of wills. James simply made suggestions through the rope, and the horse chose whether to comply. More often than not, after brief consideration, the stallion did comply, And each time James rewarded this cooperation with praise and the release of pressure. It was patient work that required complete focus from both of them, but by midday the stallion was following James with reasonable consistency, responding to the subtle cues transmitted through the lead rope. As the afternoon heat built, James led the stallion to a shaded area among the rocks where they could rest out of the sun. He removed the halter and allowed the horse to relax completely, not wanting to push too hard and risk undoing the progress they had made. The stallion grazed on the sparse grass that grew in patches among the rocks, occasionally approaching James to nuzzle his shoulder or investigate his pockets. James shared some of his remaining provisions with the horse, bits of apple he had been saving for this purpose, and the stallion accepted these treats with obvious pleasure. It was during this peaceful interlude that James heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving through the canyon with the deliberate pattern that characterized Cordell's hunting technique. James felt his jaw tighten with frustration. He had hoped to have more time before having to deal with this confrontation, but circumstances had forced the issue. The stallion had heard the riders too, and his entire demeanor changed in an instant. His head came up sharply, his ears swiveled toward the sound, and his muscles tensed as if preparing for flight. James moved to his side and placed a calming hand on his neck, speaking softly, trying to convey through touch and voice that there was no need for panic. The riders emerged from behind a rock formation, perhaps 200 yards away. There were 4 of them, and James recognized Cordell in the lead. They spotted James and the white stallion almost immediately, and James saw the surprise register on their faces as they realized how close together man and horse were standing. Cordell raised his hand to halt the other riders, then urged his mount forward alone, approaching James and the stallion with visible caution. As he drew near, James could see the mixture of emotions playing across the professional horse hunter's face: surprise, grudging respect, and unmistakable irritation. Cordell reined in his horse about 30 feet away, far enough to avoid alarming the stallion, but close enough for conversation. He looked from James to the white horse and back again, taking in the scene before him with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating horses and the people who worked with them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of professional pride wounded by what he was witnessing. He said that Thompson had sent them out to resume the hunt, that the 3-day deadline had expired, and that James needed to step aside and let the professionals do their work. There was a challenge in his tone, an implicit suggestion that whatever James had accomplished was insignificant compared to what needed to be done. James responded quietly, but firmly. He explained that he had made significant progress with the stallion, that the horse had accepted a halter and was learning to be led, and that giving Cordell and his team permission to resume their aggressive tactics would destroy everything that had been built. He suggested that Cordell return to Thompson and inform him that the situation was under control, that the stallion would be delivered to the ranch, but on James's timeline and using his methods. It was a bold statement from an old man in worn clothes facing a professional with a team of riders at his back, but James delivered it with a calm certainty that gave his words weight. Cordell considered this for a long moment, his eyes moving between James and the stallion. James could see the calculations running through the other man's mind. Cordell's reputation was at stake here. He had been hired as an expert to accomplish what others had failed to do, and now this shabby old cowboy had apparently succeeded where he had not. Accepting James's request would mean admitting defeat, acknowledging that a different approach had proven superior to his own professional methods. But Cordell was also practical enough to recognize when a situation had changed in ways that made his original plan obsolete. He could see the leather halter on the ground near James's feet, could observe how calmly the white stallion stood in proximity to the old man, could note the absence of fear or aggression in the horse's posture. These were not things that happened with a truly wild horse, and Cordell knew it. Whatever James had done, however he had accomplished it, the result was undeniable. The stallion was no longer completely wild, and attempting to chase him now might well undo that progress and make the eventual capture even more difficult. After a long silence during which the only sounds were the wind moving through the canyon and the soft stamping of horses' hooves, Cordell nodded slowly. He said that he would return to Thompson and explain the situation, and that he would recommend giving James additional time to complete what he had started. But he also made it clear that this recommendation came with conditions. James would have 2 more days to deliver the stallion to the ranch. If he failed to meet that deadline, Cordell and his team would resume their hunt with no further delays or negotiations. The professional's tone made it clear that this was not a suggestion, but an ultimatum, a final extension of trust that would not be repeated if James proved unable to fulfill his commitment. James accepted these terms with a simple nod, understanding that he had been granted more than he had any right to expect. Cordell gathered his reins, gave the white stallion one final appraising look, then turned his horse and rode back to his waiting team. James watched them disappear behind the rock formations, then turned his attention back to the stallion. The horse had remained remarkably calm during the entire encounter, though James could see the tension in his muscles and the alertness in his eyes. The stallion had trusted James's presence and quiet assurance enough to suppress his instinct to flee, but the arrival of other riders had clearly unsettled him. James spent the rest of that day working with the stallion, reinforcing the lessons they had begun in the morning. He put the halter back on and practiced leading the horse through various terrain, teaching him to navigate obstacles and respond to subtle direction changes. The stallion proved to be a remarkably quick learner, his intelligence and willingness to cooperate making the process far easier than James had anticipated. By evening, they could move together with a coordination that suggested weeks of practice rather than mere hours. That night, James made camp in a different location, wanting to introduce the stallion to the idea that their partnership would involve movement and change rather than simply staying in one familiar place. The horse adapted to this change with minimal stress, standing near James's fire and accepting his presence as natural and unthreatening. James played his harmonica as usual, the familiar music creating a sense of continuity amid the changes, and the stallion seemed to find comfort in this routine. When James finally lay down to sleep, the horse was standing close enough that James could hear his breathing, a deep and rhythmic sound that spoke of trust and contentment. The following day dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the journey that James knew they needed to begin. He had 1 day remaining to deliver the stallion to Thompson's ranch, and the journey would take most of that time. James broke camp methodically, packing his few possessions onto his old gelding and preparing for departure. The white stallion watched these preparations with interest, seeming to understand that something significant was about to occur. When James approached with the halter, the horse lowered his head willingly, accepting the leather without resistance or fear. The journey back to the ranch tested the developing relationship between James and the stallion in ways that their time together in the canyons had not. The horse had to navigate unfamiliar terrain, pass through areas where other animals grazed, and adjust to the constant forward movement that walking with a lead rope required. There were moments when the stallion balked, when his instinct to remain free clashed with his growing trust in James. During these moments, James never forced or punished. He simply waited, speaking softly, giving the horse time to work through his fears and doubts and arrive at his own decision to continue. They stopped frequently to rest and to allow the stallion to graze and drink. James was in no hurry despite the deadline hanging over them. He understood that arriving at the ranch with an exhausted, stressed horse would defeat the entire purpose of his careful approach. Better to take the time needed to keep the stallion calm and cooperative, even if it meant cutting the timing close. As they traveled, James talked to the horse constantly, pointing out landmarks, explaining where they were going, describing what would happen when they arrived. He had no idea how much the stallion understood, but the sound of his voice seemed to provide reassurance during moments of uncertainty. By late afternoon, they had covered perhaps 2/3 of the distance to the ranch. James decided to make camp for the night rather than push on in darkness. He found a suitable spot near a stream, with good grass for grazing and shelter from the wind that had begun to rise as the sun set. He removed the halter from the stallion and allowed him to move freely within the area, trusting that the horse would not flee. That trust was rewarded when the stallion, after drinking from the stream and grazing for a while, returned to stand near James's fire, choosing proximity to the human over the freedom to wander. As darkness settled and stars began to emerge, James reflected on the journey they had made together. It had taken less than 2 weeks from his first glimpse of the stallion to this moment, but those weeks had contained experiences that would stay with him for whatever remained of his life. He had connected with this magnificent creature in ways that transcended the normal relationship between humans and horses. They had become partners in a way that respected the stallion's nature, while also acknowledging the reality of the changing world they both inhabited. The final morning of their journey arrived with a sense of inevitability. James woke early, aware that by noon they needed to be at the Thompson Ranch, or face the consequences of broken promises and resumed hunts. He prepared quickly, breaking camp with practiced efficiency, and was pleased when the stallion approached him voluntarily as he retrieved the halter. The horse seemed to understand that this was an important day, that something significant awaited them at the end of this journey. They covered the remaining distance at a steady pace, not hurrying but not dawdling either. As they approached the boundaries of Thompson's land, James could see riders in the distance, ranch hands going about their daily business. Word of their approach must have spread quickly, because by the time they reached the main yard, a crowd had gathered. Thompson stood in the center of that crowd, flanked by Cordell and several of the Cowboys who had attempted to capture the stallion during previous efforts. Their faces showed a mixture of emotions: disbelief, respect, resentment, curiosity. No one had truly believed that the shabby old man would succeed where so many others had failed. James walked steadily toward the gathered crowd, the white stallion following at the end of the lead rope with a composure that seemed to defy everything these men knew about wild horses. The stallion's ears were forward, his steps measured and calm, showing none of the panic or resistance that would have been expected from an animal that had fought so hard to remain free. The crowd parted silently as James approached, their eyes fixed on the magnificent creature that moved with such grace and dignity despite the halter that marked his transition from wild to tamed. Thompson stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He walked slowly around the stallion, examining him from every angle, looking for signs of mistreatment or force that might explain how this old man had succeeded where so many others had failed. But the horse showed no evidence of abuse, no marks from ropes or whips, no trembling fear or broken spirit. If anything, the stallion looked healthier and more confident than he had during previous sightings, his coat gleaming, his eyes bright and alert, his bearing suggesting a creature that had made choices rather than had choices imposed upon him. After completing his inspection, Thompson turned to James with a question that carried the weight of genuine curiosity beneath his typical arrogance. He wanted to know how James had done it, what secret technique or special knowledge had allowed him to accomplish what professional horse hunters and experienced cowboys had been unable to achieve. James considered his response carefully before speaking. He said simply that he had given the stallion time and respect, that he had approached the horse as a partner rather than as property to be conquered. He explained that the stallion had chosen to accept the halter, that every step of the process had been based on the horse's willingness rather than on force or intimidation. Thompson listened to this explanation with visible skepticism. His entire life had been built on the principle that power and money could overcome any obstacle, that enough force applied in the right way would eventually break any resistance. The idea that patience and respect could achieve what aggression had not ran contrary to everything he believed about how the world worked. Yet the evidence stood before him, impossible to deny. The white stallion that had humiliated 20 of the finest cowboys in the region now followed an elderly drifter with apparent willingness, responding to his subtle cues and maintaining a calm demeanor despite being surrounded by strangers. Cordell, standing nearby, spoke up at this point. He said that he had witnessed James working with the stallion in the canyons, had seen the connection between man and horse, and could confirm that no force or cruelty had been employed. The professional horse hunter's voice carried a note of grudging admiration, the respect of one craftsman for another who had demonstrated superior skill through different methods. Cordell added that in his professional opinion, the stallion was not broken, but rather had been convinced, a distinction that would matter greatly for the horse's future usefulness and temperament. Thompson considered all of this for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his leg in the gesture that his employees had learned meant he was thinking through a problem. Finally, he gestured toward one of the fine corrals that had been prepared for the stallion, ordering his men to take the horse and get him settled. James felt the lead rope being tugged gently as a ranch hand reached for it, but he did not immediately release his hold. He looked at Thompson and said quietly that he would appreciate the opportunity to settle the stallion himself, that the horse would adapt more easily to his new circumstances if the transition was managed by someone he trusted. Thompson's first instinct was to refuse this request, to assert his authority and ownership by having his own men handle everything from this point forward. But something in James's demeanor gave him pause. Perhaps a recognition that the old man's request came from genuine concern for the horse's welfare, rather than any desire to claim credit or maintain control. After a brief hesitation, Thompson nodded his agreement, and James led the stallion toward the designated corral, with several of the ranch hands following at a respectful distance. The corral was spacious and well-maintained, with sturdy fencing and access to both shelter and open sky. Fresh water filled a large trough, and hay had been piled in one corner. James led the stallion inside and removed the halter, giving the horse freedom to explore his new environment. The stallion walked the perimeter of the corral, sniffing at the fencing and investigating every corner with the thorough attention that characterized his intelligence. James remained inside with him, speaking softly, explaining what was happening and what would come next. After completing his inspection, the stallion returned to stand near James, seeking the reassurance of familiar presence amid these unfamiliar circumstances. James spent the next hour with the horse, helping him adjust to the corral and establishing routines that would provide structure and comfort. He showed the stallion where the water was, encouraged him to eat some of the hay, and simply maintained his calming presence while the horse processed this dramatic change in his life. The ranch hands watched this process with interest, and James took the opportunity to explain to them how the stallion should be approached, the importance of patience and quiet confidence, the need to respect the horse's intelligence and sensitivity. Some of the younger men listened attentively, recognizing that they were receiving instruction from someone with rare knowledge and experience. Others remained skeptical, still believing that the old ways of force and dominance were ultimately more effective. When James finally left the corral, he found Thompson waiting for him outside the barn. The ranch owner had the promised reward in hand, a substantial sum in bills and coins that represented more money than James typically saw in a year. Thompson extended the payment with a grudging respect, acknowledging that James had fulfilled his part of the bargain and earned his compensation. But as James reached for the money, he found himself hesitating, a thought crystallizing in his mind that had been forming subconsciously throughout the journey back to the ranch. James withdrew his hand and looked at Thompson directly. He said that he would accept the reward, but only on one condition. He wanted Thompson's agreement that the stallion would be treated with the same respect and patience that had brought him here, that the horse would not be subjected to the brutal breaking methods that were common with difficult animals, and that if at any point the stallion's spirit seemed to be suffering under captivity, James would be allowed to take him back to the canyons and release him. It was an audacious demand, essentially asking Thompson to place conditions on his ownership of property he had paid handsomely to acquire. Thompson's face darkened at this unexpected turn. He was not accustomed to having conditions placed on transactions he considered complete, especially not by hired help, who should be grateful for the generous payment being offered. But he was also a practical man who recognized when he was in a weak negotiating position. The white stallion represented significant value, both monetary and in terms of prestige, but that value would evaporate if the horse became unmanageable or died from mistreatment. James clearly possessed knowledge and skill that Thompson's regular employees lacked, and maintaining access to that expertise might prove valuable in the future. After a tense silence, Thompson agreed to James's conditions with one addition of his own. James would remain at the ranch for at least 2 weeks to help with the stallion's transition and to train the ranch hands in proper handling techniques.